So I'm at the beach right now, and it just made me think of the final scenes of Infinite Jest when Gately's in the hospital and he's dying, and in his mind, he kind of goes to the beach and he can hear the waves going in and out. And it just made me want to share my thoughts on, I guess what I think the point of Infinite Jest is, what the meaning of the book is, that I feel that I've never seen expressed or talked about, which is unfortunate. So I think it's a continuation off Wallace's first novel, Broom of the System, which I believe Wallace himself has said is more or less like a conversation between Derrida and Wittgenstein. And I guess the real tension in that book, and it's the tension that Wallace kind of struggled with throughout his career and what he wrote about a lot, is, sincerity versus irony, or you could even say to a degree like realism or sincerity versus irony or postmodernism. And, I think he saw Derrida as, the champion or, the symbol of this postmodern movement in fiction that was going on. And I think he saw Wittgenstein's philosophy, at least the later Wittgenstein, as a kind of antidote to it. But Wallace obviously had problems with it. So for Derrida, meaning is always deferred. So you only really get lowercase m meaning if you get meaning at all. So meaning only comes about as an interplay between these symbols, and meaning's always, it's always kind of cast aside or deferred. Yeah, there's this problem in language of infinite regress that is very evident with Derrida's philosophy, which to a degree you just have to kind of accept that language is strictly like contextual in its meaning, and that it's just between the interplay of signs. But there's this problem of definition, this infinite regress that happens where to know the meaning of the word, you have to go to the dictionary, and then that definition is itself composed of words, which you need to then go look up. And it's going to be this infinite cycle of just digging deeper and deeper into the dictionary. And, Wallace and a lot of other people, a lot of philosophers have kind of dealt with this problem. They've thought about it. And Wallace, I guess, chose Wittgenstein as the champion to kind of overcome this, at least for him. And, for Wittgenstein, meaning is very much about use. So if you want meaning, if you want to know what something means, just see how it's used in conversation, see how it's used in language games. But there's a problem with this as well, that he points out in his first book. So in Broom of the System, there's a character, there's two characters named Lenore, if I'm remembering correctly, and one is the grandmother who goes missing. And she was a student of Wittgenstein, and she's explaining kind of this philosophy of language, and she's talking about how it's used. So she's holding this broom and she's saying, okay, so this broom is called a broom because of its use, because I can sweep with it, it has this handle, it's used for cleaning things up. And then she smashes a window with it. And what we're supposed to take away from this is, well, it's still a broom, right? Even though she, essentially used it as a weapon or as a tool of destruction in that moment, it did the opposite of actually clean up. And yet we all kind of know that it's still a broom, even though, in that instance, if we called it a broom, if we're, good Wittgensteinians, we'd be wrong because that's not its use case. So we recognize there is kind of this problem where there is kind of a substance to things. And Derrida, he does not believe in, metaphysical substance. And, Infinite Jest kind of tackles this from the perspective of an I. So Wallace really was concerned with solipsism, and from not only rescuing the self, but rescuing the possibility for there to be other selves, and then how to communicate. So in the early Wittgenstein, he kind of comes to this conclusion, like, that maybe he can only know that his mind exists for sure, and that's it. Because there's always this infinite gap of symbols between us that make true communication or interface, nearly impossible. So for the later Wittgenstein, though, we rescue meaning to a degree by saying it's defined by its use. So to know the meaning of something, we just have to know its use, but the problem with this is we also kind of do away with substance to a degree. And there's also the problem of, interior experience, and that being essentially meaningless because, I can't communicate accurately my phenomenological experience to you, at least not like totally. So the example Wittgenstein uses is something called the beetle in a box, where, everyone has this box that only they can look inside of. And, everyone calls what's inside their box a beetle, but you'll never be able to see into someone else's box. So what's actually in the box, what your beetle looks like, if it's even a beetle, it could be like a feather and everyone just calls it a beetle. It doesn't really matter. It's actually meaningless to talk about because it only matters about how it's communicated. So beetle in this case just takes on the meaning of the thing that people talk about that's in their box. It would not have the meaning of beetle as we use in everyday conversation. And this is a really good analogy for how we perceive, qualia in the world. So when I say red, you actually have no idea if we're seeing the same red. This is a very whoa, I just smoked weed for the first time and I had this thought kind of, philosophy 101 thing, but it's still a very relevant problem in philosophy, is this communication gap and this problem of qualia and consciousness, which is very strange. And, I think Hal in Infinite Jest, at least at the end, at the beginning, when he is no longer able to speak, I think he embodies this kind of private language or this problem that kind of was left in the wake of people like Wittgenstein and Derrida, where, you have this. So for Derrida, the self is just purely grammatical, and for the Wittgenstein, it's meaningless. The actual I or these substances that may or may not exist, they're meaningless. And for Derrida, they don't even exist. They're just properties of grammar because everything is just text, right? And since all text can be deconstructed and it's just an interplay of signs, it's also kind of, in the grand scheme of things, meaningless. And Wallace just saw this as unacceptable. So you get this character Hal who, through most of the book is this incredibly good speaker, and he's an incredibly good Wittgensteinian. He doesn't really have an interior life. He communicates, kind of, I guess what you would call autistically. He's the ideal subject for Wittgenstein. He uses language properly, only as a language game is how he sees it. But at the end or the beginning of the book, when Hal is no longer able to speak, he has this very rich interior life, but no one can hear him because he is the embodiment of this private language. So people just hear kind of shrieking, and he sounds like a monster. And I think this is supposed to be, a kind of joke. Wittgenstein once said that, if a lion could speak, we would not understand him. And I think, when people are saying he sounds like a monster and they have to kind of restrain him, that he sounds like an animal, I think this is kind of the joke that Wallace is pulling, and that he wants us to make this connection to Wittgenstein. But, the problem is that, Hal actually, there is meaning. Hal tells us at the beginning of the book, I'm in here. And, it means a lot to him. He is feeling pain. He's feeling all of these things. There is very much a self in there. There is very much a substance. The broom is the same, whether it's sweeping or it's hitting. And I think the book is about use, So the two main arcs are contrasted with a halfway house and addicts who are literally users. And then you have tennis players who, essentially dedicate their life to this sport. And I think Wallace is really trying to make us see that meaning it does arrive out of use, being of use for others, being of service of others, of striving for something greater. But it's also kind of twisted in this kind of ironic word game where, people are using instead to get meaning. and that can be through drugs and all these types of methods of, solipsistic, nihilistic consumption that lead to, what's essentially just a lobotomy, where a robot has, functionally made you paralyzed, but it's just hitting your pleasure centers. And, I don't see meaning in that. But through these other acts, these acts that Gately pull at the end of, protecting the halfway house, and, these moments of love between him and Jolie, and, Hal at the end, when he kind of finds his interior, there are moments of meaning. Tennis itself, anyone who's played a sport, they understand that it doesn't happen often, but there are occasionally these moments where you do feel like the person you're playing against, or sometimes it can even be your own teammates, that there is something deeper being said. There is actually an interface or form of communication that's going on that almost transcends symbols. And this is paradoxical, but it feels almost like a shared private language. And I think the way Wallace communicates this paradox of kind of a shared private language, this type of communication that transcends symbols, which is, antithetical to communication, is through this wraith, where, he can bypass talking by, essentially communicating telepathically. And he does this with Gately, right? And I believe Gately calls this, or it's the term that I like too, ghost words. And, Gately is kind of getting this language that, even though he's never used these words before, they're popping into his head, and he completely understands them. He understands the definition. And it's this perfectly direct interface. And if you read Infinite Jest, hopefully, this is my experience, and hopefully it was yours as well, that there'll be these moments where you don't feel like you're reading. You don't really see the symbols on the page, that, it almost feels like you are in Wallace's head, and he is just kind of guiding you. You get into that kind of zone, that state of samsara while reading, where, you don't feel your ass in your chair, and you are kind of just gliding, and it does feel like getting direct meaning pumped into you that transcends symbols. And I think this is, again, I know Wallace is known for, new sincerity, but it is kind of ironic that I think the point of Infinite Jest, the book, is that it is supposed to be the antidote to Infinite Jest, the movie, that is, nihilistic, solipsistic consumption. So, there's reasons for that. If you read the book, yeah, it uses one pair of quotes, which is common when you're doing a quote inside another quote. And I believe this is because James and Candenza's The Wraith is the one kind of, it's the book is all in his head, essentially, because it talks about how the Wraith doesn't experience time normally, and the book is out of order, and it takes place from all these different perspectives, but you always get the same consistent voice. So I believe it's a ghost word. It's a quote within a quote, which is why it's written like that. And there's also, James and Cadenza J.I., Infinite Jest I.J. It is this kind of reversal of, poison to antidote. And I think the antidote is really being of use. And I think what, James is trying to do is kind of write this either with his son or for his son, because I think the footnotes are absolutely written by Hal, or at least, I think James is because I think they mentioned that Hal can't write either. So I think James is somehow possessing him the way he possessed Orthos Dice, and kind of forcing him to read, and he lets Hal do the footnotes because they are very encyclopedic and, pedantic, autistic, and it's very much in Hal's voice. There's even a footnote where he messes up the definition of a derivative, which is, if you took high school math, you should probably remember what the definition of a derivative is. And, Wallace wrote a book on calculus. I'm guessing he knew what the right formula for a derivative is. I'm assuming an editor looked over his book, so I'm assuming that was intentional. And I'm assuming the single quote was also very intentional. And I think this is why. I think it's, the book at the beginning, it starts out where, himself just can't talk to his son. He feels like he can't understand him. And I think it makes sense if, at the end it comes together to where, Hal can no longer be understood by others. And for the first time, this is when his father can understand him, because he can directly interface. And now Hal actually has this inner life. So there's also this irony of, the characters in the book. At the end, Hal digs up his dad's kind of skull looking for the anti-entertainment that they think is in James and Condenz's head. And, how great would it be if it was in his head in the end? It was, this book, his thoughts that we're now reading. Because Wallace, people talk about how the book is formatted like a Serbinsky gasket. And so it's these tiny little, character arcs, these, triangles with, their own climaxes, rising actions, all this stuff. But the book itself as a whole, it looking at it at face value, it doesn't have that. But it's only when, you put all those triangles together and you kind of step back that you see all those triangles put together itself make up a greater triangle. And again, I think this is a metaphor for, the type of meaning that Wallace is looking for. So in a way, it is almost the metafiction that Wallace was criticizing, but it's different because it's not explicitly meta. It only comes about once you step back, once you're so engrossed in the text. It's like when you stare at something for too long and then you blink and you can see the after image kind of in your eye. And that's what Infinite Jest does when you think about it. I think this is part of the, transcendence of symbols, that if you really engross yourself in something, that's when that meaning, if you give yourself to it completely, that kind of after image of capital M meaning comes about. Even at the beginning of the book, there's that quote, I agree with Hegel that absorption is God, or something like that. And I think this is what Wallace is talking about, that giving yourself to a higher person, because the book is also very much about possession, So you have demonic possession in the form of drugs, and then you have this kind of divine possession where you're giving yourself to something higher. And that higher doesn't even have to be, a religious calling. It can be tennis. It could be devoting yourself to, works of art. And yeah, I think those are my thoughts on Infinite Jest. I've been rambling for too long. This is probably really boring and bad, and I'm sorry if it was unintelligible, but I just wanted to get that out there. If you do watch, I hope you enjoyed it. I'm in here.